Let's kick off this explainer and dig into a truly fascinating, if really sobering, piece of history. You know, when we picture empires expanding and indigenous peoples being displaced, we usually imagine physical conflicts, right? Battles, armies, outright force. But the disposition of the Maasai in East Africa, well, it wasn't just won on a battlefield. Looking at the historical sources, it was largely pulled off through a highly calculated playbook of what we might call paper weapons. Bureaucracy, law. Today, we're going to see exactly how an entire vibrant way of life was literally overwritten by administrative grids.
Here's our quick roadmap for today. We'll start by looking at the fluid pastoral landscape. See what happens when the imperial grid enters the picture. Examine these so-called treaties of displacement. Dig into the legal erasure for settlers. Uncover the ecological excuses. And finally, look at the confinement and policing. Let's get into it.
Section 1. The fluid pastoral landscape. Let's look at how things actually worked before all this started.
Just look at the sheer contrast here. The Maasai system covered a massive ecological zone across what's now Kenya and Tanzania. And they didn't use fixed land ownership, that wasn't the point. Their whole system relied on seasonal mobility to manage cattle across dry and wet zones, governed by complex clan structures. On the flip side, you have the British system bringing in rigid administrative grids, fixed boundaries, and an obsession with settler agriculture. It's basically a massive collision between a highly sophisticated, fluid system built for ecological uncertainty and a rigid European mindset obsessed with drawing lines on a map.
Historian Richard Waller sums this up perfectly, calling the Maasai organization fluid but regulated. And this is a super important point to grasp. The British looked at the Maasai moving their cattle around and just saw chaos. Or even worse, they saw quote-unquote unused land. But as Waller notes, this mobility was not a lack of organization at all. It was actually a deeply regulated scientific adaptation to the landscape, completely built on generations of localized ecological knowledge.
All right, moving to Section 2. Enter the imperial grid. Here's where the British intervene. When the British arrived, their absolute first priority was classifying the land. So they introduced these European legal concepts like Crown Land and Wasteland. Now, because the Maasai obviously didn't carry around European-style paper title deeds, the colonial administration basically used these terms as a massive legal loophole. They effectively categorized perfectly managed, life-sustaining grazing lands as entirely vacant, claiming ultimate ownership for the Crown simply because, well, the land didn't have fences around it.
Historian A.T. Matson really hits the nail on the head here. He says the administration didn't just take land, they completely redefined reality on paper. They transformed living, breathing ecological landscapes into a rigid administrative grid strictly to prioritize potential settler farms over the actual physical realities of the indigenous people who were literally already living right there.
Which brings us to Section 3, Treaties of Displacement, and how these formal relocations actually played out.
Just look at this timeline. It is wild how fast this escalated. Starting with the Protectorate in 1895, things moved quickly. By 1904, the first major Maasai Agreement pushes communities completely out of the incredibly fertile highlands like Laikipia and Naivasha and into these designated reserves. Then, by 1911, under even more pressure, the British force a full evacuation from the Central Rift Valley, pushing the Maasai further south into semi-arid areas. In practically no time, this completely shatters their seasonal livestock cycles and their inter-community grazing alliances.
Now, when you hear the word treaty or agreement, you probably assume there was some sort of fair negotiation, right? But as the historical evidence makes abundantly clear, these agreements were heavily skewed by severe power imbalances and outright coercion. Historian Robert W. M. Speer points this out, saying these treaties function way less as mutual contracts and far more as pure instruments of territorial consolidation. They were essentially just tools to legitimize clearing people out of the highlands.
Let's look at Section 4, Legal Erasure and Settlers. This is the colonial playbook in action.
It was a literal step-by-step process. Step 1, the administration passes this series of Crown Lands Ordinances in 1902, 1915, and 1919. Step 2, this legislation instantly strips indigenous communities of any legal recognition. And Step 3, because the land is now legally considered empty, the government can freely lease or sell it off to European settlers. Legal historian H.W.O. Okoth Ogendo captures the sheer bureaucratic devastation of this beautifully. He points out that these laws converted customary occupancy into administrative invisibility. I mean, just think about that phrase for a second, administrative invisibility. By simply changing the rules of how land was documented, the colonial state turned a highly visible, active society completely invisible on paper. They rendered them legally landless on the very earth they had managed for centuries.
But, why the sudden, desperate rush to clear the Rift Valley in the first place? Well, follow the money. The British actively pushed this land grab because of economics. There was a huge demand for fertile land to grow cash crops like coffee, tea, and wheat. Plus, the new Uganda Railway suddenly skyrocketed the economic value of the Rift Valley. As historian Caroline Elkins points out, the entire colonial settler economy was structurally dependent on taking these indigenous land systems and converting them into commodified, European-owned agricultural estates.
But this brings up a pretty huge question. You've really got to wonder, how did the colonial government actually defend clearing out the Rift Valley? How do you justify this kind of massive disruption, not just to the Maasai, but to the public back home or the international community?
That brings us to Section 5, the ecological excuses. This is where science gets weaponized.
The administration desperately needed a scientific cover story, and they found a very convenient one in the tsetse fly and veterinary control. Colonial officials started arguing that certain regions were totally unsuitable for indigenous cattle because of disease risks, or they claimed the Maasai were overgrazing the land. So they used these pseudoscientific claims to justify restricting Maasai mobility, declaring these vast areas uninhabitable for pastoralists. And then, surprisingly enough, those exact same areas were quickly reassigned for commercial use or European agriculture. Go figure.
Historian R.M. Hodgson argues this point brilliantly. He says the colonial policies basically recast indigenous land use as ecological degradation, all to legitimize kicking them out. It was a perfectly executed conflation of environmental management with political land control. By claiming they were just trying to save the land from overgrazing or disease, they gave themselves the perfect excuse to push the Maasai out and serve settler interests instead.
Finally, Section 6, Confinement and Policing, and how they actually enforced this grid.
The ultimate end result of all these treaties and ordinances was forced confinement into what they called native reserves. Now, legally defined spaces might sound official and proper, but they were structurally entirely insufficient for traditional grazing. Remember, for a pastoralist, survival literally relies on dynamic mobility. You have to move to survive droughts and seasonal shifts. So this reserve system effectively trapped a dynamic ecology in fixed, tightly regulated zones, which fundamentally crippled their ability to survive.
And to make sure the Maasai stayed inside these artificial grids, the colonial state brought the hammer down with strict coercive policing. Any movement outside the reserves was instantly criminalized as illegal trespass. This was brutally enforced by district commissioners and native authorities through harsh fines and forced returns. But most devastatingly, they used the confiscation of livestock as a direct punishment. They deliberately crippled the economic stability of the Maasai to guarantee compliance.
Legal scholar Mahmoud Mamdani points out something really profound about this. He notes this wasn't just physical policing happening on the ground. It was the total institutionalization of confinement through administrative law. These colonial governance structures essentially created ethnicized territorial boundaries, legally locking people in the specific zones strictly based on their identity, and then backing the whole thing up with the coercive, violent power of the state.
When we step back and look at the sheer legacy of these paper weapons, it's honestly staggering. By layering coercive treaties, sweeping land ordinances, pseudo-scientific ecological excuses, and strict policing, the colonial state basically pulled off a masterclass in bureaucratic erasure. They restricted mobility, they compressed a vast, thriving grazing system into entirely unsustainable reserves, and they systematically denied legal ownership, literally all through the stroke of a pen.
It really leaves us with a profound question about the illusion of legality. If administrative systems, legal frameworks, and even scientific jargon can be weaponized this effectively to make an entire society invisible on paper, we have to ask ourselves, how clearly are we really seeing the mechanisms of power at work in our own world today? I hope this explainer helps you look at the mechanics of history and the absolute power of the written law in a totally new light. Thanks for joining me.